I was scrolling through my phone that Sunday afternoon, lazily tapping through the usual flood of family updates on social media. There it was, my mother's latest post, something that usually made me smile. She had written, "So blessed to have such a beautiful family," followed by a trail of heart emojis. I clicked on the picture, ready to see the familiar faces, the warm smiles, the comforting sight of home. But as the image expanded on my screen, my heart didn't just sink. It seemed to plummet into some cold, bottomless place inside me. I wasn't there. My spot, right between my brother and my cousin, had been neatly trimmed away. The others stood shoulder to shoulder in perfect symmetry, the background cropping so seamless that if you didn't know better, you'd think I'd never been there at all. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she'd chosen a different shot from the reunion. Maybe I'd simply stepped away when they took this one. I swiped again, looking for the next photo, but it was the same picture, cropped, polished, and shared for the world to see. My stomach twisted in a way I can't quite describe. It wasn't just about the image, it was the symbolism. A picture captures a moment, but in this case, the moment had been deliberately edited, and I wasn't part of it. I stared at it for a long time, zooming in, trying to find any trace of myself. I remembered exactly what I'd been wearing that day. A navy blue shirt, my hair pulled back, my smile just slightly nervous because I never felt entirely comfortable at these gatherings. But here, in this perfect square of smiling faces, there was no trace I'd ever stood there. It wasn't just a missing person in a photo, it was an erasure. Memories of the reunion started flashing back in disjointed fragments. I remembered the smell of my mother's perfume when she hugged me at the door. The way my father patted my back with that half-hearted affection that always felt more like a formality. I remembered the awkward small talk with relatives I barely knew, the way my mother hovered near my siblings but never quite beside me. I remembered, most of all, that moment when someone, maybe my uncle, had asked, "Should we all get together for a picture?" I joined the group because that's what you do. You smile, you pose, you try to fit into the puzzle, even when you feel like a piece from another set. My sister had shifted closer to my brother, and I'd stepped in at the edge, leaning slightly to make sure I was in the frame. The photographer had counted to 3. We'd smiled. The flash had gone off. I was there. I was in that moment, and yet, not anymore. My phone buzzed with a new comment notification. Someone had written, "What a perfect family." I stared at those words, the irony hitting harder than I was ready for. Perfect, yes. Perfect now that I was removed. Perfect without me. I thought about calling my mother right then, demanding an explanation, but I knew how that would go. She'd probably laugh it off, say something like, "Oh, the picture looked better that way," or worse, act as if I was being overly sensitive. Maybe she'd tell me it was a simple edit, no big deal, just to make the composition look nice. But deep down, I knew. Edits like that aren't accidents, they're decisions. I set my phone down, but the image kept playing in my mind like a cruel loop. My absence felt louder than my presence had ever been. I walked to the mirror in my apartment and stared at my own reflection, half expecting to see the edges of myself fade, pixel by pixel, like in the photograph. It was absurd, but that's what it felt like I was slowly disappearing from the narrative of my own family. The thing is, I had been feeling this invisibility for years, long before a cropped photo gave it a physical form. I had always been the one on the edge of the group, the one who wasn't asked for opinions, whose milestones barely got mentioned. Birthdays felt like obligations for them, not celebrations. I was tolerated, not cherished. But seeing it manifest so literally, seeing myself removed from the picture, was a different kind of wound. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was still sitting there, my phone on the table beside me, the glow of the screen fading to black. My mind replayed every small moment over the years when I'd been left out. School events where no one came, family vacations where my name was added as an afterthought, conversations where my voice didn't even register. All those moments had been quiet, almost invisible cuts. This one wasn't quiet, this one was loud. And in that silence that followed, somewhere deep inside me, a small decision began to form. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. If they wanted to erase me from their picture, I was going to give them something they couldn't crop out, something that would sit right in the middle of their perfect table, impossible to ignore. That was the night I started thinking about the envelope. I can't remember the first time I felt invisible in my own family. It's not like there's a specific date I can circle on a calendar and say, yes, that's when it started. It was more like a slow fade, a dimming of the spotlight, until one day I realized there had never been one shining on me at all. Some people grow up with the constant hum of approval in the background, praise for grades, applause at recitals, laughter at the dinner table when they tell a story. I grew up in the quiet. Not peaceful quiet, more like the kind that fills a room when no one notices you're there. When I was 7, I won an art competition at school. It was a small thing, just a colorful drawing of a tree with roots that looked like veins, but my teacher made a big fuss over it. She called my parents, invited them to a little assembly where I'd be given my certificate. They didn't come. My mother said she had errands to run. My father said he was too busy at work. I remember standing on the stage, clutching the paper, scanning the small crowd for a familiar face, and finding none. When I got home, I tried to show them the certificate, but my sister had just brought home a new puppy, and suddenly, my piece of paper was nothing more than background noise. It became a pattern. Birthdays where the cake came from the discount aisle, because my brother's sports gear had priority. School plays where my seat on the edge of the stage meant my father could duck out early if he needed to. Conversations where I'd start speaking, only to be interrupted mid-sentence by someone asking my sister about her latest boyfriend. The worst part wasn't even the lack of attention. It was the constant feeling that when they did see me, they didn't quite know who they were looking at. They knew my name, my age, my relation to them, but the essence of me, my likes, my dislikes, my dreams, those were blank spaces on their mental forms. I don't think they could have told you my favorite color if you'd asked. Family dinners were the clearest evidence of my status. We'd all sit around the table, my father dominating the conversation, my mother chiming in with stories about neighbors or her work, my siblings tossing back jokes like tennis balls. I'd try to join in, but my words always seemed to drop into the soup like heavy dumplings, sinking without a ripple. If I did get a response, it was usually a quick, polite nod before the conversation veered back to someone else. Eventually, I learned to keep my mouth shut and focus on my plate. Silence was easier than being reminded over and over that my voice didn't carry in that house. There were moments when I tried to break the pattern. I remember once, at 15, I came home with news that I'd been chosen for a small scholarship to attend a summer writing program. I'd spent weeks working on my application, pouring my heart into essays and samples. When I told my mother, she barely looked up from folding laundry. "That's nice," she said, before calling my brother into the room to ask about his grades. I stood there holding the acceptance letter, feeling like a ghost waving at someone through fogged glass. After a while, invisibility becomes a kind of second skin. You stop expecting to be seen. You stop hoping for the extra chair to be pulled out for you in the group photo. You tell yourself you're fine without it, that independence is better than attention. But deep down, there's a part of you that aches for it anyway. A small, stubborn part that refuses to stop knocking on the locked door, even when your knuckles are raw. There were brief flashes of recognition, usually when it benefited them. If they needed a favor, a ride, or someone to watch the house, I was suddenly reliable, dependable, though never celebrated. I was like a piece of furniture, useful but rarely admired. And when the task was done, I faded back into the wallpaper. I think that's why the cropped photo hit me so hard. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the culmination of every silent dinner, every overlooked accomplishment, every moment where my presence didn't matter enough to even be acknowledged. Seeing myself erased from that picture was like the physical proof of something I'd felt all along. It wasn't just that they didn't notice me, it was that they didn't want to. Looking back, I realized that these years shaped me in ways I'm still trying to untangle. I learned to be watchful, to read every subtle shift in tone, every glance that passed over me. I learned to find comfort in my own company, because waiting for theirs was like waiting for rain in a drought. But I also learned to hold on to certain things, small victories, private joys, that they could never take away. And maybe that's why, after all those years of being invisible, I started to think about becoming impossible to ignore. Family reunions always felt like stepping into a play where I hadn't been given the script. Everyone else seemed to know their lines, their cues, their roles. I was just there, standing in the wings, waiting for some invisible hand to wave me in. That particular reunion was no different, at least at first. It was held at my parents' house, a sprawling two-story place that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something roasting in the oven. I arrived a little early, hoping that maybe for once they'd be glad to see me without the distraction of 100 other people. My mother opened the door, her lips curling into what could have been a smile if it weren't so tight. "Oh," she said, as if she hadn't expected me to actually show up. She stepped aside. No hug. Inside, the house was already buzzing. My siblings were there, surrounded by cousins, trading inside jokes I didn't understand. My father was by the grill, beer in hand, laughing with an uncle about something political. I drifted from room to room, smiling at people, offering polite hellos, but it was clear I was an extra in someone else's scene. Every conversation seemed to close just as I arrived, like doors gently shutting in my face. At one point, I found myself standing near the kitchen island, holding a plate with nothing but a few crackers and cheese. My sister breezed past me without so much as eye contact, her arm linked with our cousin's. My brother asked my father if he'd seen the latest scores, his voice carrying easily across the room. I cleared my throat, about to join in, but before I could get a word out, my uncle's voice boomed over mine, and the moment was gone. It might have been easier to just fade into the background completely, but then I heard it. My mother, standing in the corner with two of my aunts, her voice low, but not low enough. "I'm telling you, it's just easier without all the drama." One of the aunts asked, "Who?" And my mother glanced in my direction. Just a flicker, but enough. "You know who," she said, then changed the subject. I don't know what drama she thought I brought. I wasn't the one with loud arguments or messy breakups or legal troubles. My crime, as far as I could tell, was existing in a way that didn't fit the image she wanted. That word, drama, echoed in my head like a drumbeat, making every smile I forced after that feel brittle, every polite laugh taste bitter. By the time someone suggested the group photo, I was already raw. We all shuffled outside to the backyard, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Everyone began arranging themselves like chess pieces. My sister and brother took the middle, my parents flanking them, the rest of the family filling in around. I hesitated for just a second before stepping to the edge, as usual. I leaned in slightly, trying to make sure I'd be in the frame. The photographer, a distant cousin, raised her phone. "Ready? 1, 2, I smiled. And then, just before 3, I heard my mother's voice, soft but clear. "Maybe we can crop it later." It was like being slapped, not hard enough for anyone else to notice, but hard enough to leave a mark. I felt my smile falter, but the photo was taken anyway. Everyone laughed afterward, adjusting their hair, moving on to the next thing. No one noticed the way I stepped back, my stomach knotting tighter with every passing second. For the rest of the evening, I moved on autopilot. I laughed when I was supposed to laugh, nodded when someone spoke to me, but my mind was stuck on that moment. Maybe we can crop it later. It wasn't just a comment about the picture, it was the whole story of my place in this family, condensed into 6 words. I was always something to be edited, adjusted, trimmed away. The breaking point didn't come in a dramatic explosion. There was no shouting match, no slammed doors. It came in the quiet drive home, headlights cutting through the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. I kept replaying the day, every slight, every look that passed through me instead of landing on me. The cropped photo wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. And that thought didn't make me sad anymore. It made me furious. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew I couldn't keep letting this happen. I didn't have the energy to fight for a place in a family that kept shoving me to the edge of the frame. But I could make sure they'd remember me, even if they didn't want to. I could give them something they couldn't crop out. That night, I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and an envelope. I didn't know exactly what I would write yet, but the seed was planted. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. People assume that keeping a secret is a passive act, like you're just sitting there with something hidden in your pocket, waiting for the right moment. But it's not like that. Keeping a secret, one that could change everything, is active work. It's the constant awareness of what you know and what they don't, the careful control of expressions, the way you bite back certain words mid-sentence. It's like holding a glass of water perfectly still while walking across a shaking bridge. I'd been carrying my secret for almost a year by the time the cropped photo incident happened. It started with a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had stopped by my parents' house unexpectedly, hoping to drop off a small gift I'd found for my father, a first edition of a book he'd once mentioned liking. As I walked up the driveway, I heard voices through the open kitchen window. My parents were inside, speaking in low tones, and I caught my own name like a hook snagging fabric. "She doesn't need to know," my mother was saying. "She'll find out eventually," my father replied, his voice tired. "By then, it won't matter," she said. "It's better this way." I froze, my hand still on the gate, the book pressed against my chest. They weren't talking about some minor family detail. They were talking about me. I stayed just long enough to hear my mother say one more sentence, the one that burned into my memory. She was never supposed to be part of that. That. The word was vague but heavy. It could mean anything, a will, a family business, something from the past they'd buried. I left without knocking, the gift still in my hands, my mind racing. Over the following months, I became an expert in collecting pieces without letting them see I was assembling the puzzle. A stray document on the corner of my father's desk, a conversation my sister let slip after a couple glasses of wine, a vague remark from my uncle when he thought I wasn't listening. Slowly the picture started to form, and it wasn't pretty. It turned out there was money. Not just money, property. Land my grandparents had owned, land that had been in the family for decades, passed down through generations. When my grandparents died, it was supposed to be divided equally among their children. But somewhere along the line, paperwork had been adjusted. My parents had decided that I didn't need my share, that it would be simpler if my brother and sister got everything. They'd done it quietly years ago, long before I even knew the land existed. Legally, it was shady. Morally, it was betrayal. But what made it worse was the way they'd done it without a word, as if I was so inconsequential that they could erase me from inheritance the same way they erased me from a photo. I kept this to myself. At first, I told myself it was because I needed proof, but in reality, I think I was savoring the quiet power of knowing something they didn't know I knew. Every time my mother made some cutting remark, every time my father gave me that distant half smile, I thought, if only you knew I could blow all of this wide open. I started collecting everything, copies of deeds, bank statements, old letters from my grandparents that mentioned the land. It became my private archive, kept in a locked box at the back of my closet. Some nights I'd take it out and spread everything across my bed, looking at it like a war map, tracing the lines of my family's deception. When I found the final piece, a letter my grandfather had written before he died, clearly stating his wishes for the property, I knew I had them. They couldn't talk their way out of this. They couldn't crop it or blur it or pretend it didn't exist. That knowledge became my shield. At family gatherings, I'd sit there quietly while they laughed and talked around me, knowing that I held the kind of truth that could shatter the table we were sitting at. It wasn't revenge, at least not yet. It was simply balance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the powerless one, but after the photo incident, after hearing my mother say, "Maybe we can crop it later," something in me shifted. I realized I'd been holding this secret like a lifeline, but maybe it was meant to be a weapon. Not a physical one, but something sharp enough to cut through years of silence and dismissal. The envelope came into focus in my mind. Not just any envelope, one thick enough to hold copies of every document, every letter, every piece of proof. I could place it on the table at the next family gathering, in front of everyone. I could watch their faces change as they opened it, as they realized what I'd known all along. I didn't know if it would make them sorry. I didn't know if it would make them love me or hate me, but I knew it would make them see me. And after a lifetime of being invisible, that felt like reason enough. The day I brought the envelope felt different from the start. I woke up before sunrise, the sky outside my window still heavy with that grey, early morning quiet. My hands shook a little as I made coffee, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing this wasn't just another family gathering. This was the day I'd stop pretending. This was the day I'd set something down in front of them that they couldn't look away from, no matter how much they'd want to. I'd chosen the envelope carefully, heavy cream paper, the kind you'd use for wedding invitations or legal documents. It wasn't flashy, but it carried a certain gravity. Inside, I'd placed neatly organized copies of everything. The deeds, the bank statements, my grandfather's letter. Each page was numbered, stapled, and labeled. I wanted there to be no confusion, no loopholes they could slip through. When you've been erased your whole life, clarity becomes your revenge. I slid the envelope into my bag and drove to my parents' house in silence. No music, no podcasts, just the hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of my own breathing. My mind wasn't racing. I'd already played this scene out in my head 100 times. The only unknown was how they'd react. When I arrived, the house was already buzzing. Laughter spilled from the backyard, where the grill smoked and children ran in circles. I greeted a few relatives on autopilot, making small talk while my eyes scanned for the perfect moment. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of every invisible year had been condensed into those folded pages. Lunch passed in the usual blur, my father holding court with one of his long stories, my mother flitting between conversations, my siblings leaning into the center of the group while I sat on the edge. As always, I didn't rush. Timing mattered. You don't drop a bomb in the middle of chaos. You wait for the silence after the laughter, the moment when people are listening without even realizing it. That moment came just after dessert. Plates clinked, coffee was poured, and a gentle lull settled over the table. My mother sat across from me, her chin tilted, her eyes scanning the room like she was taking attendance. My father leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on his stomach, looking content. I reached into my bag. My movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of calm that comes when you've already decided there's no turning back. I placed the envelope in the center of the table. The sound it made against the wood was louder than it should have been, sharp, clean, final. "What's this?" my father asked, his voice casual, but his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something you should all see," I said, my voice steady. I didn't look at anyone directly. I wanted the envelope to be the center of their attention, not me. My sister reached for it first, curiosity pulling her forward. She opened the flap and slid the papers out, her brow furrowing as she flipped through them. My brother leaned over to look, and I saw his jaw tighten. "What is this?" my mother asked, her tone sharper now. "It's the truth," I said simply. "The truth about the land, about what Grandpa wanted, about what you decided without telling me." The silence that followed was different from the usual silence I'd known in this family. This one was charged, almost electric. My father took the papers from my sister and began reading, his expression unreadable. My mother didn't reach for them. She just stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You went through our things?" she finally asked, her voice cold. "No," I said. "I went through my things, things you decided didn't belong to me anymore. I just decided to take them back." There was a murmur around the table, cousins whispering, an aunt clearing her throat. My brother dropped his gaze to the table, avoiding mine. My sister's eyes darted between our parents and me like she was watching a match she hadn't bet on, but was afraid to lose. My father set the papers down slowly, his fingers drumming on the table. "You don't understand how complicated this was," he said, his voice low. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I understand that you thought I didn't matter enough to include. I understand that you've been erasing me for years, and this time you tried to make it permanent. But here's the thing." I leaned forward slightly. "You can't crop me out of this." For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had thickened. My mother's face was pale now, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. And I just sat there, steady, letting the weight of the envelope do the talking for me. Eventually, someone, an aunt maybe, asked if they could pass the papers around. I nodded. One by one, the documents made their way around the table, and I watched as realizations spread across faces. Whispers turned to quiet, tense conversations. I stayed silent. I'd already said what needed to be said. When the last page came back to me, I slid it all neatly back into the envelope. No one tried to take it from me. No one told me I was wrong. They just watched as I put it back in my bag, as if the act itself was a closing scene. That night, when I drove home, the silence in the car felt different than the one I'd driven there with. This wasn't the silence of being unseen. This was the silence after you've made yourself impossible to ignore. After that day, nothing in my family looked the same, though on the surface, life went on as if it had. They still had their little gatherings. Photos still went up on social media. My mother still sent the occasional group text about birthdays or anniversaries. But there was a fracture now, one you could feel in the pauses, in the glances that lingered a second too long. I didn't hear from them for almost 2 weeks after the envelope incident. No calls, no texts, just silence. At first, it felt like a victory. I imagined them sitting around their kitchen table, the same one where they'd made all their quiet decisions about me, now wondering how I'd managed to piece it together. I hoped it kept them up at night. But then the messages started. First from my sister, short, clipped, almost cautious. "We should talk." Then from my brother, who usually kept himself out of the crossfire. "Mom and Dad are upset. I think they feel ambushed." That word, ambushed, made me laugh out loud. I thought about all the years I'd been ambushed by their indifference, by the way they'd made me disappear in plain sight. When my mother finally called, her voice was tight, controlled. She didn't apologize. Instead, she talked in circles about misunderstandings and complicated circumstances and how I'd misinterpreted the documents. I let her talk. I didn't argue, didn't interrupt. I'd already given them the evidence. They could twist it however they wanted. It wouldn't change the truth. What surprised me wasn't the lack of remorse. I'd expected that. What surprised me was how light I felt, even in the middle of all that tension. For so long, I'd carried this ache of invisibility, the constant effort of trying to be seen, and in that one moment at the table, I dropped it. I wasn't asking to be included anymore. I wasn't waiting for their approval or their acknowledgement. I'd stopped needing it. The news about the land began to spread quietly among extended family. An aunt called to say she'd always suspected something wasn't right. A cousin messaged me late at night, saying she admired what I'd done. Of course, there were others who thought I'd gone too far, that family matters should stay in the family. But to me, that was just another way of saying, stay quiet so we can keep doing what we've always done. The next family event I attended was awkward, but not in the way I'd feared. People watched me differently now, not with affection maybe, but with a kind of wary respect. I wasn't just the quiet one on the edge of the group anymore. I was the one who'd stood up in the middle of the table and laid everything out for everyone to see. And whether they liked it or not, they couldn't unsee it. My parents avoided being alone with me. They stuck close to my siblings, their conversations full of deliberate cheer. It was almost comical, like they thought if they smiled hard enough, they could pretend the envelope had never existed. But every time their eyes met mine, I saw it there, the knowledge. They knew I knew. They knew I'd acted. And that alone shifted the balance in a way I'd never thought possible. I never got my share of the land. I didn't expect to. That wasn't the point anymore. What I got instead was something they couldn't take back, a place in the narrative they couldn't erase. Before, they'd been able to crop me out of photos, conversations, decisions. But now, whenever they told the story of our family, the envelope would be there, whether they mentioned it or not. In the months that followed, I learned to live without waiting for their version of love. I stopped showing up to every gathering out of obligation. When I did go, I stayed on my own terms. I didn't force my way into group pictures. Sometimes I wasn't even in them at all, and for the first time that didn't sting, because it wasn't about being invisible anymore. It was about choosing when and how I wanted to be seen. There's a strange kind of peace in that. Knowing you can walk away without feeling like you've lost something, knowing you've told your truth out loud, and no matter how anyone else spins it, the people who matter will understand. Every now and then, I still take out the envelope. It sits in the bottom drawer of my desk, the papers inside as crisp as the day I handed them over. I don't need it anymore. It's not a weapon I plan to use again, but it's a reminder. A reminder that the version of me they tried to write out doesn't exist anymore. The cropped photo still exists somewhere, probably on my mother's phone, maybe framed in her living room. I don't care, because now, every time I think about that image, I picture something else. The envelope on the table, everyone leaning in, the silence wrapping around us like a sealed room. That was the day I stopped waiting to be invited into the frame. That was the day I made my own. If this story moved you, don't let it be the last one you hear. Subscribe now and join a community where every voice matters and every story finds its place. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next twist, the next truth, or the next moment that will make you think twice about the world around you. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Let's keep this conversation going together.